So if you want to help someone with a disease or a medical problem, it makes a lot of sense you to ask people with a disease or medical problem what you could do that would make their lives better. And that's a really critical part of device development from start to finish now, including thinking about what should the endpoints be, how should you assess whether the treatment works. On the drug side, a slightly different tack is being taken, but it's quite interesting. It's bringing in people with diseases, with medical problems, irrespective of the drugs or biologics that are being developed, but asking them to think as a group about what they would like to have done, what they see as the problems that need to be solved. And then the FDA is taking notes and sort of inculcating that into its way of thinking. But now we're entering this very exciting, explosive era where in the past we would depend on advocates of patients. You might talk to a half a dozen people who might represent 1 million people with a disease. But now, with social media and with the broad use of the internet, we can communicate directly with people. And it's not that the FDA per se needs to do that all the time, but we would really encourage industry to think that way. That's the best way to really develop products in the future is going to likely be to involve a lot of people with the disease so that you have a handle on what their needs are, what their expectations are, what their risk tolerance might be.
Do you think,
go from there.
So you're kind of throwing out the challenge to people here that they should communicate more broadly with patients. Do they have the regulatory kind of safe harbor, or do they have the legal ability to do that in the way that you're talking about, or does something have to change in terms of regulations or guidance at the FDA to make that possible?
Well, I think when it comes to product development, I'm not aware that anything really has to change to do the kind of things that I've said. Once you have a product or you're in a clinical trial, there are concerns that people would have about surreptitious advertising and things like that. So, as to whether some of those details will need to be changed, I think we'll learn as we go along. Because if you just look back just a couple of years, it's unimaginable that you'd have billions of people with personal devices that could communicate. So no one anticipated in the rules exactly what that regulatory scheme should look like. We'll learn about it as we go along. It may need to change some, but I'm not aware of the details now of what we should say about that.
One of the things that patients also are interested in doing, and the Device Center has kind of been in the forefront of this, is having some input into the level of risk that FDA is willing to take about products. Can you talk a little bit about that, about what the patient role is in setting, and patient preferences in setting risk tolerance for regulatory decisions?
Well, I think this starts at the beginning, and if you look across the whole FDA, not just devices, I think the device group has really taken a lead role in objectifying this issue. You'll see that the standard, the way things are done, does vary according to the characteristics of the disease and the people who have it. So, on two extremes, if you have a rare disease with no treatment that's effective, you'll find that in general people are willing to take more risk, and the requirements for the type and size of study needed are different than the disease that I studied most of my career, coronary disease, that affects hundreds of millions of people, and we have a number of effective treatments already. In fact, a lot of arguments have been made if people just adhere to the therapies for coronary disease, it would have a much bigger effect than any new therapy that we could develop. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. So we end up with these two ends of the spectrum. There's a lot of work to be done about where we fall in between that. But I think, so let's get everybody included in the ecosystem. Industry should be involved in this, of course, under a set of principles. And I had an interesting discussion yesterday with industry about this. There are traps you can get into with patient advocacy groups if you're seen as directly funding them to do particular things that are in your financial interest. But I was involved before I came to the FDA in publishing some of the principles that would lead to a sort of a situation that was the right way to do things. But the advocacy groups themselves are in a very powerful position because they don't have to take a position on any particular product, but they're the people who can best describe what their needs are and what the level of risk for their disease that would be appropriate.
So one of the things that advocacy groups want, you've recently released a statement about it, is better access to experimental drugs. Two questions about that. One is there was a lot of comment in the media that announcement might have been related to a particular product. Was it? And the second more important question is, how satisfied are you with the system as it exists today for patients to get access to experimental drugs? Does something more need to be done?
Well, anyone who has ever worked with the federal government would know right away that you couldn't react to a situation that fast in the federal government to put out a statement like that. This is something that had been worked on for years. It wasn't something that just came because of a particular issue that we were facing. So, this is before my time, but it's always been FDA policy that the first route for a person who's seriously ill and where there's no standard treatment that could be effective that's known, that the first route should be to enter a clinical trial if that's possible. If that's not possible, either because the person's not eligible or because it's physically not possible, let's say they live in North Dakota and the only study site is in Atlanta and they can't get back and forth, there's always been an FDA policy to try to link that patient up with access to an experimental drug. But, it was learned the paperwork was extensive. I know this meeting is competing with ASCO, but Rick Pastor, who heads our OHOP group, it's public knowledge, his wife recently died of cancer, which was tragic. She was a cancer nurse clinician, and he personally had trouble getting the paperwork done. He's been very outspoken about it. And so there was a pretty intense effort to reduce the paperwork, make it easier to get it filled out. But it's still the case, as you well know, that FDA doesn't give people access to experimental drugs. Companies that make the drugs own them. They have to make that decision, and there are a lot of considerations. Among them, there may be a very limited supply. If you can't get a clinical trial done, then you're depriving future patients of access to the drug, as one example. There are other concerns about, is it really a good thing to do to take an experimental treatment for which the risks and benefits are completely unknown. And of course, that's an individual decision. FDA's policy is we'd like people engaged in that discussion and to be able to make that decision as well as they possibly can. So hopefully our recent changes are at least taking one step towards making it easier. But it's not the final solution. And there was a public meeting with Reagan-Udall that just occurred about this. How much can we facilitate the interaction between patients out there and the companies? A lot of complicated issues, but we're very sincere about working on it. By the way, I didn't say anything. I've been graduating my youngest son from medical school and then surviving a wedding for 300 millennials at 10,000 feet in Colorado right before coming here. So I have no voice left. So if you can't hear me, raise your hand or something. And my ears are clogged up, so I can't hear myself.
Well, you're coming across. So we talked a little bit about what patients want. If you talk about what companies want, what some of the CEOs at this meeting want from the FDA, one of the first things that's going to be on their list is the ability to communicate more about their products, to communicate about off-label uses of their products, to communicate about on-label uses in ways that aren't on the label. You know where I'm going with this. Is there anything that, I know you're constrained in what you can say, but is there anything that you can say about what FDA might do or when it might do it to give more guidance on communications?
Well, let me describe the ideal situation that I hope everyone would hold as an aspiration. It's my personal view of the ideal situation. When we're talking about things that go on the labels, they're human studies. I call them human experiments because you've got consent from a human being to do a study, or you've had consent waived by an IRB to do the study because it's minimal risk and a whole set of other criteria are met. But in that situation, the IRB is acting on behalf of the people on whom the research is being done. And that consent is a commitment to create generalizable knowledge. So that to me means if you have useful information from a human study from which useful knowledge has been gleaned, you have a commitment to make that knowledge public. So then I ask the question, what is the information that companies have that's not public that they'd like to communicate privately to physicians and to patients? And so just follow my train of logic here for a minute. And then you say, what is it that's known about the use of a drug or device that shouldn't be in a label? And what I would say is that we need to do a better job, and there's some FDA action that needs to be taken here to make it easier. Is that there's really useful information about the use of a product, and it's going to be used across the entire United States, much less the entire world. The one place that you know that information is going to be available to everyone is in the label from the FDA for the prescriber and the patient information. And you'll see some interesting things about patient information coming from the FDA in the very near future also. And so I think the first order of business ought to be to make sure we get everything in the label that ought to be there. And then the leftover information, we do have to figure out how to deal with it in this much more complicated, information-intensive environment that we're in. My personal view is that companies controlling that information is not a good idea. That doesn't mean I'll carry the day. That's just the way I see it.
What can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that? What kind of
It's
information?
publicly available. For example, professional groups and clinical practice guidelines can analyze that information and make it available fairly easily. And in fact, if you take an FDA label and a clinical practice guideline for a disease, you pretty much got the playbook by which people ought to think about how to use a medical product. So those are the kind of things that we're considering. But on the other hand, we know there's a lot of interest in this area. We are working on it. I know I'm doing a little tap dancing here, but that's the job. I can't really say exactly what we're thinking about doing.
Can you say anything about when we might?
That's the worst thing I can ever do.
Okay, well, I'm going to shift on to it.
But I mean, I will say, because I think people that have worked with me know this is a matter of great personal interest to me. People do know how to use products in the ideal way. I've had a lot of experience working with industry in my past. I have great respect for industry. But in general, as a professional, I've not looked at industry to be the least biased source of information. So that the extent that industry has information, it's definitely my goal to get it out there. I just want to make every effort to have it go through channels which don't have bias. Because remember that truthful and misleading is a complicated scheme. Truthful and not misleading.
Yeah.
Because you could do a study and you could publish all the positive results and it would be truthful. Would it be misleading if you just failed to mention some of the negative results?
Truth's in the pudding, I guess.
Yes.
Some people would say it was. You mentioned here, a lot of what you're talking about really comes down to the best ways to generate evidence. We're talking about how to communicate evidence, but you've spent a lot of your career working on ideas about better ways to generate evidence. What are you doing about that at FDA, and when can we start? Okay, we'll avoid the one question. What can we think of FDA doing to change the way that evidence is generated?
You know, like a lot of people that are enamored of a particular idea, I see everything through the lens of evidence. And it's very noticeable at FDA when we have really good evidence. Decisions are relatively easy. There still might be controversy because people interpret evidence in different ways. But the type of controversy is very different than we have to make decisions with poor evidence. And we have this alarming trend that's going on, particularly in medical products, where the cost of clinical trials is going up like that. It's about, by some economists' estimates, the cost of clinical trials is rising at about 3 to 4-fold the consumer price index. That's obviously not sustainable. And no one wants to see all the investment in new therapies going into just clinical trials. This is playing right into my hand for what I've worked on my whole career. So the idea would be, we live in a country now where everyone has an electronic health record. Like it or not, it's happening. Our tax money paid for it. There's a proliferation of quality registries, both within integrated health systems and in professional societies. Because for doctors to get paid, or hospitals to get paid, they have to demonstrate certain levels of quality. And claims data, is readily accessible. So you put that into a tapestry of information, and maybe a lot of the clinical trials that are larger, later phase clinical trials that are very expensive right now could be done at a much lower cost if we use integrated health systems and the data that's already available in clinical trials, in clinical care, so that we reduce the tremendous cost of creating standalone data systems, flying nurses around to check the data, very expensive stuff. And to that end, if you look across the federal government, let me say first of all, this is not something that would ever be controlled by the federal government. We know that wouldn't work. The question is, can you create a different playing field that would radically reduce the cost of doing clinical trials while actually getting us better data about what people really care about, which is health outcomes related to the use of medical products. And I think we're close to that point now because the NIH has a number of pilot programs doing randomized trials within clinical health systems. We have Sentinel, which has 190 million Americans worth of claims data to look at safety of drugs right now, but we're beginning to turn that to allowing industry to use it and also to use the claims data for prospective studies. And we have projects like the Precision Medicine Initiative, which are calling on Americans to volunteer for clinical studies. And here I feel privileged to be able to say this since I am a doctor. And also to tell their doctors, it's not up to you as a doctor to tell me whether I should be in a clinical trial or to have my data used for the advancement of science. My medical record belongs to me, not to the doctor or the health system. And if I think it's in my interest, which most Americans say it is, to have data used for the advancement of everyone's better health, I'm going to do it. That's a big part of what the Precision Medicine Initiative is about. So as you think of this very different landscape, it's a different playing field to generate evidence. It could be much higher quality. And the sample sizes that we used to struggle to get by trying to find patients by going to doctors, now if you got 300 million electronic health records, as the coding gets better and better, generating sample sizes may not be such a problem anymore.
So this is a good segue. You mentioned the Precision Medicine Initiative. FDA's obviously got a big role in making that happen. One of the elements of it, I don't know if it's formally an initiative, but certainly relevant to precision medicine, is going to be next generation sequencing. And I know it's something that you've personally worked on a lot. What are your thoughts about the regulatory environment for next generation sequencing? Why you devoted a lot of time to it? Why is it important? And what's going to happen?
Well, one reason I'm devoting time to it is the president personally told me to do it. And one thing I've learned in Washington, if the president actually personally tells you to do something, it's a good idea to do it. But of course, the other thing is it's amazingly exciting. I mean, a lot of people know that in the past I've not been the biggest advocate of genetics and medicine, not for rare diseases where it's always been important, but for common diseases. But it's now the technology has advanced to the place where it's really going to work. And the question for all of us is, given the explosive nature and the multidimensionality of the information, how do we turn that information to uses that have benefits that outweigh the risks? And how do we avoid the temptation that people have because the technology is moving so fast, to make claims that are not proven in ways that we can do it. So just to back up for 1 second, some people in the audience know I had a history at the previous university where I worked, that we had a group of investigators who, before most people figured out that you could use genomics to figure out what chemotherapy might be effective. The problem was they forgot to do the math. And a number of really competent investigators wrote something close to 100 papers where the data were simply not reproducible. And I had to deal with that. Now, these were not stupid investigators. These were smart, well-intentioned people who wanted to help people with cancer. What's the lesson from that? The lesson for me is when you have complex science, very data-intensive, very math-oriented, you'd better have a system to guarantee the quality and the integrity of the work that's being done. All right, so with that preamble, now let's go to NGS. We go from one test at a time, one biomarker, one protein, one electrolyte, whatever it is, to essentially 3 billion tests at a time. Francis Collins himself at a meeting last month said we know about 1% of what we're going to know about genetic impact on health. That means that 99% of what's generated from the base pairs that are simply observed is going to be an unknown. We'll see all these variations. We won't know what they are. Now, if we use the old method, a professor invents something, forms a company, the company raises capital, it develops a test, then it has to find a population and see what the clinical operating characteristics are. You can imagine what the time frame it would take to work out all this information. Just it never felt at the FDA like the right thing to do. And again, this is work before my time, so I'm inheriting it, and I'm really proud to do so. So the idea that developed in conjunction with NIH as part of the Precision Medicine Initiative was to say, let's create common workspaces in the cloud. And again, what an amazing time. If you'd said in the cloud 6 years ago, people would have said, is this guy smoking pot or what? What's going on? But now, we're there. The computing limits are just, practically non-existent. That's not completely true, but for practical purposes. And so we've started with Precision FDA, and the idea there is it's a common workspace in the cloud where people's informatics pipelines can be tested, and also they can collaborate with each other to develop the best tools. And we're able to sit back and watch this happen in conjunction with NIH. It's been very successful. We just had our first contest where we put a snip of DNA out there and said, who can figure out what's in this? 21 entities, it's academics, it's businesses, it's information technology companies, they're all going at it. And we had some clear winners. Some were better than others. The great thing is those who weren't as good can keep practicing because we're in a workspace where they can work. It's very low cost, and they have access to great tools. The next step is going to be a data commons that includes not only the genetics, but also the clinical data from populations generated by the NIH. It's going to start with cancer as part of the Cancer Moonshot. But it's also going to be open to patient groups that want to enter. Like if I had a serious disease, what I would want more than anything else is to have our information out there for scientists around the world to try to develop the best diagnostic methods and the best treatments for my disease. There are many examples where this is already happening, but we want to create a very large in the cloud space where people can work on this. So now how does this relate to NGS? What we're hoping will happen is that companies and academic centers, as they develop the technologies, will take advantage of the cooperation with many other people to, as quickly as possible, not only develop the analytical validity of the test, but also to link the differences in genetic variation to the population outcomes that will be available in the data commons. And we think this will radically accelerate the rate at which development will occur. I got to try this out last night with a group of venture capitalists about whether they thought this might work, and I was a little worried about what I might hear. But what they said, some of them may not have agreed with what some people said, but what they said was it's going to be great for investment because there'll be a pathway to develop tests. The operating characteristics of the tests will be public knowledge. And the FDA won't be slowed down because things can happen very quickly in this environment. It will be a change in the business model that people have to get used to. And of course, there's a lot of unpredictability that we'll have to work through. But if we have to use the old system of test development and validation with NGS, it just would take decades, and we're not interested in that.
Okay, I want to shift over to a